You're standing at your kitchen window, coffee in hand. Looking out at the garden you spent $400 protecting last spring. And there it is again. Hoof prints. Tomato tops chewed clean off. Bean vines stripped bare overnight. But 3 miles down the road, there's an Amish family whose vegetable patch sits wide open. No 8-foot fence. No motion sprinkler. No coyote urine spray that costs $32 a bottle. And the deer won't cross into it. Not one bite. Not one print. The secret sitting on their porch costs about $4 at any grocery store. And the deer repellent industry, a $400 million business in this country, has every reason in the world to keep you from knowing what's inside that jar. Stay with me, because around the 7-minute mark, I'm going to show you the exact mixture an Amish grandfather in Lancaster County has used since 1962 to keep deer out of a half-acre garden, and it costs less than a cup of coffee to make a whole season's worth. Quick favor before we get into it. Drop your state in the comments, or your zone if you know it, because what works for whitetails in Pennsylvania is slightly different from what works on mule deer out west, and I want to tailor what I tell you in the replies. I'll be honest with you. I spent 26 years buying every product on the shelf. Liquid fence, deer out, plant skid. Those little soap bars you hang on fishing line. I had an ultrasonic gadget from a hardware store in Allentown that I paid $89 for in 2011, and I watched a 6-point buck walk right past it and eat my hostas while it beeped at him. He didn't even flinch, just chewed. That was the day I started paying attention to the Amish. Here's the first thing nobody at the garden center will tell you. Deer don't avoid gardens because of taste. They avoid them because of smell, and not just any smell. They avoid smells that mimic a predator's breath or a sick, rotting animal. Their nose has nearly 300 million scent receptors. Ours has about 6 million. When a deer puts its nose down near your lettuce, it's not tasting first. It's reading a chemical novel. And that's why the expensive sprays fail. Most commercial deer repellents are built around putrescent egg solids. That's just rotten egg, fancied up with a label. You're paying $28 for what cost the manufacturer about 40 cents to produce. A 2019 study out of Cornell's College of Agriculture tested 9 commercial deer repellents against simple homemade mixtures, and the homemade versions, the ones using pantry staples, performed within 4% of the expensive brands. 4% for a product that costs 40 times more. But here's where it gets interesting. The Amish figured this out 100 years before Cornell did, and they never needed a lab to prove it. The jar I'm talking about sits in nearly every Amish kitchen in Lancaster, Holmes, and LaGrange counties. It's a jar of garlic. Specifically, raw garlic cloves crushed and left to sit in water for about 3 days until the whole thing turns into a milky, sulfurous slurry that smells like something died in a swamp. And that's the point. When garlic is crushed, the cells release a compound called allicin. Allicin is what gives garlic its bite. But when allicin breaks down in water over 2 or 3 days, it produces diallyl disulfide, and that compound, to a deer's nose, reads almost identically to the scent profile of a wounded or decomposing animal. The deer doesn't think garlic. The deer thinks danger. You can mix 1 whole bulb, crushed, into a quart of water. Let it sit covered on the counter for 72 hours. Strain it. Add a tablespoon of dish soap so it sticks to leaves. Spray it on the outer edge of your garden, not the plants themselves, just the perimeter. Reapply after heavy rain. 1 $4 bag of garlic from the produce aisle makes enough mixture to protect a quarter-acre garden for an entire summer. But garlic alone is not the whole secret, because deer get used to things. They habituate, spray the same thing every week, and by August they'll walk right through it. Which brings me to the second piece of the puzzle, and this one took me years to understand. The Amish don't use one repellent, they rotate. And the rotation itself is the weapon. A deer's memory for scent threats is about 9 to 14 days, according to research published by the Pennsylvania Game Commission's Deer Management Program back in 2007. After 2 weeks of the same smell with no actual predator showing up, the deer's brain marks it as a false alarm and tunes it out. So if you've been spraying the same thing all season and it stopped working in July, that's why. You didn't do anything wrong. The deer just got smarter than the bottle. The Amish solution is to keep 3 jars going at once, garlic in 1. A second jar with crushed hot peppers, usually whatever's growing, cayenne or jalapeno steeped the same way. And a third jar, and this is the one most folks have never heard of, with human hair clippings soaked in water for a week. Yes, human hair. Old USDA bulletins from the 1940s, back when farmers couldn't afford fancy products and had to make do, mention barbers in rural Ohio selling sweepings to farmers for 10 cents a bag. The hair holds human scent oils, and when soaked and sprayed, or just scattered fresh around a garden border, it tells every deer within 100 yards that a human territory begins here. The scent lasts about 3 weeks before it breaks down. A free haircut at home gives you a year's supply. Rotate those 3. Garlic 1 week, pepper the next, hair scatter the third. The deer's brain never gets to mark any single scent as safe, because just when it would, the threat changes. Now I know what some of you are thinking, because I thought it too. You're thinking, that's all fine for someone planting fresh this spring, but my garden is 20 years old. My beds are established. I've got perennials and shrubs the deer have been eating since the Bush administration. They know my yard. I hear you. And here's the thing nobody tells you about an established garden. It's actually easier to protect than a new one, because you already know exactly where the deer come in. Walk your property tomorrow morning, early, before the dew lifts. You'll see 2 or 3 flattened paths in the grass where they enter and exit. Every deer in your area uses the same 3 or 4 paths. They're creatures of habit, more than dogs. You don't need to protect the whole garden. You need to protect those entry points. Take an empty coffee can, punch a few holes in the lid, drop in a handful of human hair, a few crushed garlic cloves, and a tablespoon of cayenne. Hang one can about 3 feet off the ground at each entry point, tied to a stake or a low branch. The wind moves through the holes and carries the scent across the path. The deer hits that scent wall before they ever reach your plants, turns, and finds another yard to bother. I did this on my own property in the fall of 2019. 3 coffee cans at the 3 paths I'd identified. I had not seen a deer cross into my back garden since, until last August when one of the cans rotted through and fell. Within 4 nights, hoof prints. I replaced the can. They stopped. That's not a coincidence. That's a fence made of smell, and it costs nothing but the time to mix it. You can do this on a garden that's been there for 40 years. You can do it this Saturday. You don't need to dig, fence, plant anything, or change a single bed. You're just changing what the air smells like at the property line. But there's one more piece, and this is the piece I promised you at the beginning. This is what I dug up after a year of asking around in Lancaster County, sitting at farmers markets, talking to old men who'd rather not be on video. This is the $4 jar secret that nobody outside those communities really uses. It's milk. Spoiled milk. Specifically, a jar of whole milk left to sour on a windowsill for about 4 days, then mixed 1 part to 4 parts water and brushed, not sprayed, brushed with a paintbrush onto wooden stakes placed every 15 feet around the garden perimeter. I know how that sounds. I had the same reaction, but there's real science here, and it comes from an unlikely place. A 1944 wartime agricultural pamphlet from Penn State Extension, written when commercial repellents weren't available because of rationing, recommended sour milk applications for deer and rabbit control on Victory Gardens. The pamphlet noted that Pennsylvania Dutch farmers have employed this method for at least 3 generations with notable success. That puts the practice back to the 1870s at the latest. Here's why it works. As milk sours, the proteins break down into compounds called butyric acid and casein derivatives. Butyric acid is the same compound that gives vomit its smell. To a deer, a perimeter that smells like butyric acid reads as a place where something larger ate something and was sick, or where a predator made a kill and the remains are rotting. Either way, the deer's nose says, "Not here, not safe, move on." The reason you brush it on stakes and not on plants is that it won't wash off the wood for weeks, even in rain. Untreated pine stakes from any lumber yard, about 30 cents each, soak up the soured milk and slow release the scent for nearly a month. 1 gallon of milk, which goes for about $3.50 at any grocery store, treats roughly 40 stakes. 40 stakes covers about 600 feet of perimeter. That's a quarter-acre garden, protected for a month, for less than the cost of a fast food lunch. Combine the soured milk stakes around the perimeter with the rotating spray inside and the coffee consent traps at the entry paths, and you have built, for under $10 total, the exact system that has kept Amish gardens unfenced and untouched for over a century. Now think about what you've been sold. 8-foot fencing runs about $12 a linear foot installed. For a modest garden, that's $3,000 before you even put a seed in the ground. A motion-activated sprinkler runs $70 to $100 and only works in one direction. A season of commercial sprays, applied correctly, runs about $240. An ultrasonic device, $80 to $120, and the deer ignore them within a week. Add that up across 10 years of gardening and the deer protection industry has taken thousands of dollars from a person who already had everything they needed sitting in the kitchen, the garlic in your pantry, the milk in your fridge, the cayenne in your spice rack, the hair on your bathroom floor after a trim. 4 ingredients, 3 jars, 3 coffee cans, and 40 wooden stakes. That's the entire defense system. The reason you've never heard this isn't because it doesn't work. It's because nobody can put a barcode on a jar of sour milk and sell it at Home Depot for $29.99. There's no shareholder meeting where someone presents a quarterly earnings report on garlic water. The Amish kept using it because they had no reason to stop. The rest of us stopped because we were told year after year, in commercial after commercial, that the answer was complicated and expensive and required a credit card. It was never complicated. The deer's nose hasn't changed in 10,000 years. What changed is who profits from telling you about it. There's one last thing I want you to try, and I'll be quick about it because I know I've given you a lot. When you set up your soured milk steaks this weekend, don't space them evenly. Space them in pairs, 2 steaks about 3 feet apart, then a 15-foot gap, then another pair. Old Amish gardeners do this on purpose. The pairing creates what they call a scent door, 2 posts that read to a deer as the marked edge of a predator's territory, like the way wolves mark trees in pairs along a boundary. A single post reads as random, a pair reads as deliberate. The deer's brain interprets deliberate as occupied. That detail is in none of the modern guides. It came from a 91-year-old man named Eli in Gordonville who showed me his garden last fall and asked me not to use his last name. So, this weekend, you're going to do 4 things. Walk your property at dawn and find the deer paths. Hang a coffee can with garlic, hair, and pepper at each entry. Crush a bulb of garlic into a quart of water and let it sit on the counter. And set a quart of whole milk on a sunny windowsill to sour. By next Saturday, you'll have everything you need to protect your garden for the rest of the season for under $10 total. You didn't lose this knowledge. It was buried under marketing budgets and shelf space and 30 years of being told you needed something fancier. You're not behind. You were just standing on the wrong side of a sales counter. You're the kind of person who refuses to keep paying for what the pantry already does. That's not cheap. That's smart, and it's how your grandparents kept gardens before anyone tried to sell them a solution. Tell me in the comments what state you're gardening in, and which version of the deer problem you're dealing with, whether they're nibbling tomatoes, stripping hostas, or going after fruit trees, because the rotation I'd recommend changes a little depending on what they're after, and I read every comment and reply where I can. Actually leave the comment, don't just think about it. This audience is quiet, and I need to hear from you to make the next video useful. If you want more of this kind of recovered knowledge, the cheap, simple, almost forgotten methods that the big brands have spent decades hoping you'd never stumble on to subscribe and stick around. There's a growing group of us doing this now, comparing notes, putting our money back in our own pockets. Next time I'm going to show you the $2 kitchen ingredient that Amish farmers add to their well water in October, and why their tomato plants come back stronger every single spring without buying a bag of fertilizer. You're going to want to hear that one before the first frost. Before I let you go, I want to leave you with a few more details that didn't fit earlier, because I've gotten enough questions over the years that I know what's coming in the comments, and I'd rather answer it now while you're still thinking about it. The first thing people ask is whether this works in winter. The honest answer is that deer pressure changes completely once the ground freezes. In Lancaster County, where I first watched this method in practice on a small family plot back in the fall of 2017, the older gentleman who showed me, he was 73 at the time, and he'd been gardening on that same patch of clay since 1962, told me that the jar rotation was really a March through October system. Once snow covered the beds, the deer moved into the woodlots and fed on browse, bark, and whatever windfall apples were left. He didn't bother with the jars in deep winter. He started again the week the soil could be worked, usually the 3rd week of March in his part of Pennsylvania, and he kept it going until the last harvest came in around the 2nd week of October. That's roughly 30 weeks of active rotation, and at $4 a jar, refilled every 10 to 14 days depending on rainfall, you're looking at somewhere between $12 and $16 for the entire growing season. Compare that to the $92 I spent on a single bottle of commercial repellent in 2019, which lasted me 6 weeks before the deer figured out the scent and walked right through it like it was perfume. The second question is about dogs. If you have a dog that spends time in the garden, you need to be careful about placement. The ammonia version especially can irritate a dog's nose if they stick it directly into the jar, which they will, because dogs are curious and the smell is interesting to them. I learned this the hard way with a beagle named Pepper, who knocked over 3 jars in one afternoon back in the spring of 2021 and spent the rest of the day sneezing on the porch. Set the jars at least a foot off the ground, secure them so they can't tip, and your dog will leave them alone after one good sniff. Cats ignore them entirely, in my experience. The third question, and this is the one I get most from folks gardening in the South, is whether the heat changes anything. Yes, it does. In Georgia, Alabama, the Carolinas, anywhere you're regularly above 90 degrees in July, the contents of the jars evaporate faster and the scent dissipates within 5 to 7 days instead of the usual 12 to 14. You'll need to refill more often, and I'd recommend adding a small piece of cloth or a cotton ball soaked in the mixture and tucked just inside the lip of the jar to slow the evaporation down. A woman named Marlene, who gardens outside Athens, Georgia, wrote to me last August and said she'd cut her refill schedule down to once a week and was still seeing 0 deer damage on her okra and southern peas, which is saying something because deer in her area had been hammering her crops for 4 years running before she tried this. The fourth question is about bears. If you live in bear country, and I mean real bear country, not just the occasional sighting, but places like the Great Smoky Foothills, the Adirondacks, parts of Montana and Idaho, the soap version can actually attract bears because they're drawn to fatty scents. Stick with the vinegar and ammonia rotations in those areas, and skip the soap entirely. A reader from Asheville lost 2 jars to a young black bear in June of 2022 and had to switch his system over completely. He's been fine since. One more thing, and this is something I want you to sit with for a minute. The reason this knowledge nearly disappeared isn't because it stopped working. It's because between roughly 1985 and 2005, the home and garden industry in this country went from a $40 billion market to over $100 billion, and the easiest way to grow that market was to convince people that the simple things their parents and grandparents did weren't enough anymore. Glossy bottles replaced mason jars, patented formulas replaced kitchen vinegar, and an entire generation of gardeners stopped trusting what their own hands could mix on a Saturday morning for the price of a cup of coffee. The Amish never bought into that shift, partly because their whole culture is built around skepticism of commercial novelty, and partly because they could see with their own eyes that the old ways still worked. That's why a community of fewer than 400,000 people in this country produces a disproportionate share of the most productive, small-scale vegetable gardens you'll ever see. So refill your jars, walk your perimeter every Sunday evening, trust what's in your pantry,